All right, so here we go. Got a fiocco there already tied up. It's been cured. I'm just making sure everything is cleaned up and ready so I don't have to go looking for things. I've got my bladder here. This is from one of the pigs that we butchered. Actually, it's from the pig that this fiocco came from. It's been soaking in like tepid water for a while, and I just cut it open, and now I'm putting it in thick bottom, the thick part of the fiocco at the bottom, and then I try, if I can, to get the seam that I'm going to be stitching on the fat side of the fiocco. Um, so this bladder was a little bit bigger than it needed to be, so the seam actually, I think, goes all the way over the top. So right here, I'm just trying to reorient it a little bit to see where I'm going to be stitching, and you can see that I actually gather a lot of the casing here, and I just have a little needle with some really fine hemp twine that's doubled up and knotted at the end, so it's going to stick there when I put that first stitch through. And this is just a fairly simple whip stitch. And when I'm stitching, I'm trying to make sure that I gather enough of the bladder to keep it tight. I don't want the bladder um, to not stick uh, to the cut that I'm working with here, the fiocco in this case. So I'm just going around. You can see that I go in one side, like right here, go all the way through, pull it, and then I come right back around to the same side. So that's called a whip stitch. I don't have any sort of close up of it or anything, but if you look up whip stitch, if you want to know what that is, it's pretty simple. Some obvious things when you're doing this, you don't want to poke the needle into the meat or the fat. You just want to get the casing, in this case, the bladder. So I'm just trying to make it as tight as I can. I also know that when I truss this here in a minute, the trussing will hold most of this casing pretty tight. And like I said, this bladder is a little bit too big, so I'm going over the top, and I noticed that there was a little bit too much bladder there to kind of gather. It would have been sort of clunky, so I made sure I'd have enough to close it all the way up. You can see the opening there, but I just continue the whip stitch, and that was just to clean it up a little bit more. If I had all the time in the world, I could have fit the bladder to this fiocco and cut off a decent amount more of it, um, but it actually ended up working out pretty well. And so I'm getting down here toward the bottom. What I like to do is when I get past where the actual opening is, I do a stitch or two past it just to make sure it's completely closed up, and then I work my way back up from where I was working. That way, I know the stitching is not going to come out. And again, this isn't. Um, I'm probably a little more particular about it than I need to be, but uh, I mean, spend a lot of time doing all this stuff, so I might as well make it correct as much as I can. So I think I'm doing the last couple stitches at this point, and you'll see me kind of work my way back up. And I think I work my way back up, just doing a whip stitch again, but then I try to catch some extra string that I've already stitched with, and then try to tie a little knot. I think on this one I do it a couple times, and I'm about out of twine on my needle. So I'm just going to go back up through, tie a couple knots, and then cut that off so that the stitching will be done. And again, as tight as you can get it, and make sure that when you're stitching, you're not poking into the meat or the fat. That can be a real pain later on, especially when you peel the casing. So I'm almost done here. There, I'm cutting it off, and should be all good. And then at this point, before you start trussing, it's good to prick it to get any of the air pockets out that are in it. So while you're trussing, it's actually forcing air out and forcing the casing against the meat. So there, I'm just using a sausage pricker, poking some holes in there. And then there on the left side, I have another spool of hemp twine. It's a little bit thicker, and it's actually on like a little sort of screwdriver thing um, that's stuck into the table. There's a hole in the table. So now, if you watch what I'm doing in my left hand, but it's on the right. That string is actually just the guide that I'm holding, and then my other hand is following it. And when I get to the bottom, that's where I do the twist to get that sort of obvious sort of eight pattern at the bottom. You know, it kind of looks like a pizza or a pie the way it's separated. And so when I get all of those done and relatively tight, they don't have to be like super tight, but relatively tight, I tie an overhand knot up here at the top just to hold all of that in place. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the better you do that, the easier everything else gets. Now I'm taking those two strings and I'm going under and through. And this part's hard to see, but basically I'm going under the strings that I started with first. And what this does is I'm actually, I wish I had a close up to show, but I'm going under and then through a little loop and then tightening it at the top. So what that's doing is that's getting underneath all of those, what I call verticals. And so that when I tie my knot up here at the top, right there, and then I tie my strings together to make my hanging knot right there, when I hold it up, I don't know if I hold it up here or not, but it supports all the way to the ham at this point. And I still have the original string that I started with and I tied through, and I have a little bonus piece that I'm just tying around there to secure it. That part's not that important. So that's all I'm doing there, and I think I actually cut off the extra. So that extra string that's stuck to the spool, I actually need to pull some of that off and then cut it. And what I'm going to do with this string is I'm going to start wrapping around my verticals. So I'm going under, and all you do at this point is you start working your way around the ham. You go under each string and pass to the next one. Here I'm tying just a little knot to secure where I want to start. And so I go on the opposite side, pull it through, and then I go to the next string. And all you want to do at this step is even out your verticals so that the spacing on them is even. So you want them you don't have to do a lot of tension here. The only tension you're creating is to make sure that your verticals are evenly spaced throughout the top of the fiocco. And this applies to a culatello as well. You can do the exact same thing with a culatello. So I'm just going under the opposite side, the side of the string that's farthest away from me, and then it grabs onto that string, and I go to the next one. And this takes a little bit of practice to kind of get used to, but you also do want to look at the vertical spacing. So this is kind of make like a spiral, and you want these to be fairly even in their space from each other. So once you go around it, once you get to the next line down, I just try to create like half inch to 3/4 of an inch of spacing. And again, all I'm doing is making sure that the spacing between these vertical strings is even as much as I can get it. I'm not putting a lot of inward like pressure on the ham at this point. Um, I mean, if it's too loose, it'll be very hard to deal with. So it's not loose, but it's also not extremely tight. And on this, I'm just going to keep going around, making sure the spacing is right. And as I get a little bit further down, I do a little bit more tension. But you'll see as I make my way around here, and I'm going kind of slow, which is good. I'm not trying to rush too much, and I'm checking the spacing, looking at the shape of the ham, going under each string, making sure that it's spaced according to the other ones. You can kind of see I'm double checking that one to make sure it looks the way I want it to. And I just keep going around. Um, Then on a fiocco, because they're small, once I get to a point where the roundness of the top of the ham is pretty much done being round, I'll take my string and tie off to that extra piece. So I just do a little knot of them together, make sure it's really tight. And then I keep it connected to that spool. And here's where you control the shape. So all I'm going to do, you'll see, is I'm going to turn it, and I'm doing a lot more pressure. So my left hand is pressing on the ham, and my right hand is controlling the tension of that string. And anywhere that feels like it's out of shape, um, I'm just going to make sure I put enough tension on it. So I'm turning. You can kind of see the spacing between my lines that are going around it. And these are not tied into the verticals yet. I'll do that later once I get these horizontal strings all done. So I'm just putting pressure. You can see the ham's really taking shape. This ham was already pretty tight the way it was cured and everything. And now I'm going to keep doing this until I get to a spot where the ham starts to round off on the bottom. And then I want to cut that string, and then I want to use my little trussing tool, which is just like a flat piece of metal that's round. And this is important at this stage because the ham is really tight now after what I just did. And it's a lot harder to do this part with just your fingers like I was doing at the beginning. So a little trussing tool like this is super, super handy. I've done this without them, and you can do it, but if you're not used to it, it's really awkward and a pain. So this tool should make your job easier. If you don't have one, I used to use one. I used to use the handle of a spoon that I just cut. It was a smooth handled spoon, and I broke it right below where the spoon part is. And I drilled a little hole in the skinny end of that spoon handle and sanded off just a little bit of one of the edges of the handle, and it worked perfectly fine. This one was a knife maker. I asked him to make a few of these for us, so he did. So here I'm just going around it, um, and again, just trying to keep my spacing. Like it, some people say it's not necessary, but if you're going to go to all the trouble to do this stuff, when you do this well and get some practice at it, these things look. I mean, they're awesome looking. They look like little meat grenades, which is pretty cool. You can't. I don't know if you can tell in the videos so much, but you don't want to put a lot of inside pressure um, on these strings. Like when I was shaping it, you don't want to make big bulges in the meat. You want it to. I mean, you can see bulges there, but they're not extreme. You can still see a consistent shape of the ham. Um, And again, on this fiocco, it was already pretty tight. It would be hard to do that, but sometimes if you tie up salami, like larger format salami like this, you can get like extreme bulges in it, which is not ideal. So I'm just using my little tool, again, going to the opposite side of the string, under and back toward myself, and then on to the next string. Trying to keep my spacing consistent. And here, sometimes you do need to work on the spacing of the vertical strings a little bit to kind of finish up the work that was done at the top when I started. Um, But yeah, that's all I'm doing. When I get really far or close to the bottom, it gets really tight. And sometimes, I don't know if I do it here, but I stand it up. Yeah, right there. So I just go all the way to the bottom, and it might seem obvious, but all that's happening right now is I'm making a net um, that's really, really tight against this meat. Again, it allows to carry the weight of this meat and to put some inward pressure on it as it's drying to force some of that internal moisture outward. So I'm getting close to the end, and you would think that when I get to the very center at the bottom, I'm done, but I'm not. What um, what you want to do then is take any extra string or get new string. You'll see me in a minute. I'll tie this off at the very, very bottom to make sure it's secure. And I'll have a little bit of extra string. And that extra string, I will go up through the closest vertical, and I will tie in with loops similar to what I'm doing now. On the verticals, I'm going to tie in the strings that were just simply wrapped around the ham when I did the shaping phase, right through the middle where I was just pulling the string and not tying it into the verticals. I'm going to take this leftover string and go up through. I basically do every other vertical. You could do every vertical, but if you've ever looked at um, like old world style cured meats that have been tied like this, sometimes you'll see hams that have the strings all falling off. And that's usually because they haven't tied in the horizontal strings to the vertical strings. And if you don't do that, they'll just fall off, which again, if everything else is correct up to this point, that doesn't matter that much. But I like to keep my net looking sharp the whole time. So I tie in the verticals, and a lot of producers in Italy that do hand tying, they usually tie in their verticals as well. So I'm done at the bottom. I got it tied off. I'm checking everything, and I've got extra string. And now I'm going to go through on one of the verticals, tying in the horizontals that I just wrapped around. So I'm going on the top side, and I'm going right where those two strings cross, right where the horizontal and the vertical cross. And you just have to tie them in where they're not tied in. So at the very top where I started my work, right about there is probably where it was tied in. So I'm just going to tie a knot there on that one. But that's only one of the verticals. I'm going to do 3 more, but I ran out of string, so I'm going to tie that off, cut it with my knife, and then I like to do it all in one pass, but sometimes the amount of string can get awkward. So here I'm just kind of measuring a rough amount to do 3 verticals. That's what I was doing there. So I just get my string out again, and then I'm skipping every other vertical. So um, checking, starting there at the bottom. You want to start where they're already tied in, or wrapped around each other. Just going to tie this one little overhand knot there just so it stays secure. And then I'm going to run up this one. When I get done with this vertical, I'm going to go. Um, I just keep the string, on it, and I just kind of travel my way. I skip a vertical and go on to the next one, then go down the next one, then go over, and then go back up. And that's basically it. Um, After this, vertical tying, it should be fairly uniform. Verticals should be spaced evenly. Your horizontals should be spaced evenly. And you should have your verticals tied into the horizontals where you are wrapping it. And then you will want to prick it again just to make sure, because this tying phase it does put a lot of pressure on it, and the pricking really helps expel any air to make sure that casing is stuck to the meat. And yeah, and then at this point, I mean, if we always weigh these hams at this point, and then this is what we calculate as our green weight. So whatever this thing weighs at this point will be in our production mode. That's what we'll base some of um, our other weights off of, like when we calculate it to be done. If you're in a big operation, you're probably doing water activity and all that good stuff. We just base it off of weight. So I'm just finishing off the verticals. Yeah, and I'll be done soon, and I'll prick it, and it's going to be awesome. So hopefully this video was helpful. Um, if you have any questions, just look me up on Facebook or Instagram or on our website. That's it. I don't know if I prick it here or not, but that's it. Pretty dope.